In order to flatten the curve of the Wuhan flu, many countries and jurisdictions resorted to lockdown-style policies that in practice basically amount to sanitary fascism, and with the expected results: generalized disaster and not much success on the issue itself. But it doesn't mean the curve can't or won't be flattened. It will. The question is, what gains or losses are recorded on the way towards that goal? The same is true with narratives. They start slowly, they grow, and then there is an inflection point. And that's where the narrative of the non-feminist worldview is, or will soon be, right now. So, what's next? Let's explore. Hello everyone, my name is Lucian Valsan, and on behalf of the Freedom Alternative Network I wish to thank Mike Buchanan and Paul Elam for inviting me to this conference. Many of our members have been, at least in part, influenced by the work of these two great men. Now, as much as I despise the Wuhan cough-related policies, the reality is that I wouldn't have made it to this conference if not for the virtual format. But at least I would have gotten the chance to meet Paul once again this year, if not for the Wuhan cough. Oh well. So, for the purposes of this talk, the presentation is divided as follows. 1 brief history of the non-feminist narrative curve. 2, what is the inflection point and where we are. 3, strategies to follow. And 4, some conclusions. Alright, so let's start with the brief history. Now, last time I spoke to this audience in London at ICMI20, I had just created Freedom Alternative, and at that time it was a one-man show, but already with a view to become something like a think tank. The reason I'm mentioning this is because in London I spoke to you about the concept of agitprop, and I hope the organizers will link to my 2016 talk, so those who haven't seen that one get to view it now. Agitprop is the first step the adherents of an idea have to take, whether they like it or not, once they're numerous enough to organize. And it doesn't even have to be a high number either. So, here's a sketch of how the narrative curve looks like. On the abscissa, there's the amount of time that it passes since an idea comes around, and on the ordinate, there's the number of people who either hear or adhere to the idea. Now, this graph is valid regardless of the idea we're talking about, and hopefully by the time you are watching this I will have had the time to make a video about the general theory of the narrative curve, because this talk is a particular application of the generalized theory. So, the origin point and the first curve that you can see on the graph in the context of non-feminism is basically the prehistory of the politically activated non-feminist thought. So on the first curve, one ought to imagine people like barrister Ernest Belfort Bax, who authored the book The Fraud of Feminism 107 years ago, or George R. Esterling of Denver, who started the first group meant for judicial activism against alimony 108 years ago in the United States. That period of the first curve likely reached its nadir in the 1920s with Bund für Männerrechte, or Federation for Men's Rights, in Vienna, later known as the Equitas Weltbunde für Männerrechte, or the Equitas World Federation for Men's Rights. After that come a few attempts in the 1960s, but nothing of substance until the third of the century, when we can safely say we're into the second curve. The representatives of the second curve would be the authors of the first MGTOW Modern Manifesto, the defunct Men's News Daily, Roland's Channel or Man-Woman Myth, with whom I'm grateful to share this virtual podium, maybe the Spearhead. This would be the second curve in this graph, so let's say late 1990s till 2000 or so. Again, this is an approximation. I'm sure I missed someone. I don't know, MCFM surely somewhere on this curve as well. You get the point. Now, around 2009 or 2010, things become again a bit dull, as it's shown on the graph, and then they start growing faster than ever to the third curve, which is more or less the contemporary period, with the AVfM, J4NB, the Men's Party in Switzerland, the MRAs in Germany, who do tremendous judicial activism both within Germany and at the European Court of Human Rights, as well as the European Court of Justice, etc., etc. Somewhere between the second and third curve, we should of course mention people like Warren Farrell, the late Angry Harry, the Honey Badgers, namely figures that while they haven't in their time hit the mainstream of the non-feminist movement necessarily, they have influenced the curve much more than they're given credit even now. Now slowly but surely, the third curve is over, and we're now somewhere between the third and the fourth curve, where a non-feminist position is now routinely observed even outside of the politically activated non-feminist sector. In other words, the control we can exert over the narrative is lower than it was 5 or 8 years ago, and not because we did anything wrong necessarily, but because we did a lot of things right, and the total pool of people who can think, hear, or talk about these things has grown in ways that Ernest Belfort Bax would have considered unthinkable. Now, a portion of this year will have been lost because of the hysterical and illiberal reaction by the government on the Chinese cough. Even so, this topic in itself should be used to advance non-feminist narratives. Heather McDonald, a fellow at the Manhattan Institute and sometimes accused in these circles of being a gynocentrist, which, let's face it, she kinda is. But nevertheless, she makes a good point when she discusses the reaction to the China virus and calling it a feminized ethos, which is true. Under today's safetyism mentality, Heather says, sacrifice and risk-taking become unthinkable. The martial virtues of courage and stoicism have been sidelined and pathologized. When Donald Trump briefly left Walter Reed on Sunday in a motorcade to greet supporters, a doctor at the hospital complained that the Secret Service agents in Trump's limousine might get sick. They may die. These are the same Secret Service agents who are expected to take a bullet for a president. They were behind the plexiglass barrier in the car, all occupants were masked. Under our feminized ethos, showing resoluteness during a crisis, reassuring the public about one's well-being are no longer positive traits in a leader. They are violations of maximal risk aversion, close quote. Now, I'm recording this before the US election, but most of you will be seeing this after the US election. But regardless of the result, such discussion in these terms was unthinkable in 2012 or 2000, not even in conservative circles. This situation was called by Fiedelbogen, I believe, several years ago as going ambient, which at the time it was a desideratum, or a wish if you want. Going ambient meaning that your message, or portions of it, end up being delivered by people who are not involved with your circles or may have never heard of you in the first place. Now, due to the situation with the China virus, a bit of time was wasted. Some lawsuits are still dragging because courts aren't always open, some narratives penetrate harder because of more pressing issues, and so on. But even with this delay, we should start climbing on the fourth curve very soon. And by that, I mean in the next 6 to 8 months. And once we start climbing that curve, we shall soon hit the inflection point. So, chapter 2, what is and where is the inflection point? Now, I've shown you a couple of times the general graph, but the fourth curve doesn't necessarily have to be huge. I mean, it should be huge in order for more of our narrative to win, but it isn't a given. Only the general format of the graph is always the same, but particularities can vary at various inflection points. So for instance, in 2010 was an inflection point. By next year we will hit another inflection point, very likely the last one. So here's the second graph. It's a bit amateurish, but it gets the job done, because the point is not to have fancy graphs, but to get the general idea across. So that red X right there is the inflection point. The yellow, blue and black scenarios are not the only ones possible, but for the non-feminist narrative they are the most likely ones. Once we hit that point, and we will for sure, everyone involved in this phenomenon will have to ask themselves whether they're willing to adjust to the new situation or not. Those who will want to do basically more of the same and refuse adaptation are in for the yellow scenario, which means very moderate growth from that point on, modest gains in terms of narrative, and eventually fading away into obscurity by early 2030s. Those who will overdose on enthusiasm and will try to speed up the process will very likely be in the blue scenario, which, unlike the yellow scenario, keeps them in business and gives some continuity, but at the expense of deep frustrations. The black scenario, which is the desirable one, is the one where rapid growth ensues, the current elite is replaced by faster and more enthusiastic people who then put enough of our own into institutions based on the fast recruitment of new people, and once that is done, then the whole discussion on narrative becomes obsolete. The curve gets flattened. The black scenario is the one through which the feminists have gone through in the 1980s. That's when they reached peak narrative curve, although the mainstream didn't know that, and placed their own people in almost all institutions. What you see now is basically reactionary feminism, who is upset that others have learned to play by the same playbook. More generally, the intersectionalists did the same in the 2000s, though they followed mostly the blue scenario, which is why they appear to be harder to defeat, even though in practice they already lost. And yes, I realize that's a bold statement, but peak intersectionalism was hit in 2015. By 2025, it will be marginal nonsense. Maybe 2028 if Donald Trump loses the election. Nobody will even admit having been an intersectionalist by that time. So that is the inflection point in theory. In practice, the inflection point is not a point per se. It's not a single moment that you can point out to say, this is the inflection point, this is the moment. It's more like a series of events that signal change. So how do we identify it? Well, the same way Paul Elam and the team, including yours truly, identified it back in 2010. By gathering data and tracking discussions in as many places as possible. Yes, it's a complicated work and not entirely an exact science, but it's doable. Now, I said earlier that it may take a few more months until we start climbing the fourth curve, but in a way there are concrete signs that the non-feminist narrative might already be there. The biggest sign is when you see success way outside of the usual suspects. Take, for instance, Douglas Murray's book Madness of Crowds, a book which is, for the most part, about non-feminism, really. It goes straight to the jugular and calls the entirety of social justice straight-up madness. And it does so by pointing out men's issues explicitly, even though we can hardly call Douglas Murray an MRA. If anything, Douglas Murray is usually pretty gynocentric, since he's the standard blue pill conservative who thinks Islam is haram because misogyny. His book, however, ended up being a bestseller. People who have never heard of the men's rights movement have learned, likely for the first time, that women are not oppressed in Europe, that domestic violence is not a gender issue, or that gynocentric courts are a thing, although he doesn't call them that way, but he describes them impeccably. The best the opposition could come up with to counter his claims? Well, Douglas is blind to oppression. Smirk. That's it. And that's another sign. Not only someone way outside of our circles made it big by making our arguments, but he also wasn't ripped into smithereens in return. And they didn't even have to go through so much sorrow as Warren Farrell, for instance, had to go. Or many of you who will be watching this and have been in the trenches 10 years ago, 5 years ago, or even 3 years ago. Douglas Murray didn't have to face that, because we're in a different point on the narrative curve. Another sign of the inflection point will be art in general. Much sooner than many dare to imagine right now, a big artist somewhere, be it in music, film, or some other media, will make a huge non-feminist point in a very not subtle way. Again, non-feminist art has been a thing for several years, maybe several decades, but none have made it big yet. But one will. I have no idea which one, but it will happen, because it's an idea whose time has come, and when that will happen, it will be another sign of the inflection point. Another way to identify the inflection point is to monitor discussions in places that are presumably neutral on the topic. So no gaming forums or knitting forums, okay? I'm talking more places like the farmer circles or the grocery store, and yes, the leadership in SMEs or small and medium enterprises. The grocery store may seem like a weird place to look, but if you remember the Gillette scandal, it doesn't harm to use that one to ask around. The mood for girl power nonsense has changed for sure. But has it changed dramatically towards non-feminism? Not yet, but it's rapidly heading towards that direction. And again, soon enough, it will be at the inflection point. In bureaucracies, the same thing. For instance, Portland banned urinals in state buildings because women can't use them. Yeah, that was last year. Nobody covered that story neutrally. Nobody. Not even CNN. Everyone reported it either slightly critically or entirely critically. And that was in late 19. For comparison, in 2012, a similar piece of news from a town in Sweden was hailed all over the English language media as a hallmark of progress in the fight against the patriarchy. The Harvard Business Review mentioned in 19 a study that showed that 27% of American men now avoid one-on-one meetings with female colleagues, with false rape and harassment allegations being the #1 reason cited for that behavior in that study. Of course, this shocked the ossified progressive bureaucracy in universities, but this is yet another sign of the approaching inflection point. Based on these reasons and a few others, it is my contention that we will start climbing on the fourth curve very soon. As I said, no more than 6 to 8 months from now. All right. Chapter 3. Strategies to follow. So, the inflection point is coming. Now what? Well, as I said earlier, everyone will have to ask themselves, what do they want? Do they stay the same, in which case the curve will be flattened and with roughly devastating results, pretty much like the efforts to flatten the China virus curve? Because again, if you stay the same, the curve gets flattened and basically most of the work will have been for nothing. Because a flattened progress via the yellow scenario, to come back to the graph that I shared earlier, means that the message fails to penetrate widely, misses the window of opportunity, and achieves very little. Which in the end means that we or our children will have to take the whole curve from point zero once again, or maybe from the second curve once again. Another 10 to 15 years wasted. And here I should emphasize the difference between the doctor and the researcher. The doctor is interested in saving every patient. For the doctor, a dead patient is terrible. 10 dead patients are a catastrophe. The researcher, however, is interested in saving more people at once and accepts some losses. To the researcher, 10,000 deaths are acceptable if they save 150 million. The doctor, in this analogy, are those who run community centers or domestic violence shelters for men. Their work is important and badly needed. The researcher are people like me who look at the whole picture to find a way to make, let's say, domestic violence shelters for men legally mandatory on a national level. Yes, that doesn't help everyone right now, but once it gets implemented, it helps a lot more people over the long run than using the limited resources on one center. So this is the first thing to do. Recruit more doctors. Why? Because once you start climbing on the fourth curve, you won't need that many researchers. What you need is an increasingly visible presence in everyday life. As opposed to 10 years ago, the public is now primed and seeded for this. It is a lot less weird if you want to create such institutions at the grassroots level. Also, not just create institutions, but infiltrate existing ones. 5 years ago, it was outright dangerous for a non-feminist to be open about his or her beliefs at the workplace. Today, well, today there's plenty of room, much more room than it would seem if you just spend all your time on social media. And it will be more room once the inflection point comes. It basically becomes less weird. Remember, we started from the general perception that being non-feminist is weird. Sure, by the numbers, it wasn't weird at any given moment in history, but as I'm sure many of you all have already learned over the years, reality and numbers don't matter. Narratives and perception are all that matter. And now we're finally approaching the moment when it's no longer weird, but, well, normal. The reason it's called the inflection point, even though it's not a specific point, is because most people perceive it as a sudden change, like a switch flipped into most people's brains. Of course, nothing of the sort will actually happen. All that is changing is the perception. Keep in mind, we won't defeat gynocentrism in 6 months from now. None of us will be alive to see that happening, most likely. But we can, for sure, defeat the perception that non-feminism is weird. The most difficult part of the work has already been done, and most of you watching were part of that. So it would be quite a shame not to take advantage of this particular moment in history. So yeah, recruit more doctors. They will reveal themselves, you just have to be there to bring them in. Second thing to do, stop thinking about growth and focus on management. This is something that many fail to do, and it's an honest mistake in a way. After many years on the narrative curve, when you struggled to grow, it becomes routine to continue to think about growth first. But once you hit the inflection point, growth comes anyway. You don't need that much focus on it if you're in the non-feminist business. Because unlike feminism or some other ideology, non-feminism is neither a cult nor a force aiming to be permanent, at least not militant non-feminism. People are naturally non-feminists. As a result, once you've successfully reminded them of that, there is no need for further growth. Now, of course, that's at the end of the curve. We're far from that objective, unfortunately. And I say unfortunately because the reason I joined the cause is precisely to be there when it also ends. Anyway, once we hit the inflection point, the focus on growth is no longer needed. Of course, one should still care about growth, but the focus should be on management. How to manage the growth efficiently. And by efficiently, I mean using the growth to further our goals, our narrative. Because it doesn't exactly help anyone if you have 5 million visitors a day on your website or 1.5 million viewers per video on YouTube. Yes, that's some nice growth, but if you don't instrumentalize it, the growth is ultimately meaningless. Translation: use the faster than ever growth to convince as many as possible to get into institutions, to infiltrate, to act as agents, and thus really contribute to meaningful change. Here's an easy example. Any person can file a Title IX complaint against a university for misandrist discrimination. Mark J. Perry from the American Enterprise Institute filed 231 complaints over the last 3 years. Likely the biggest number of complaints by any single individual in the entire existence of Title IX. You don't have to be a lawyer, and all you need is a few hours to do the research and into the exact form of discrimination that you're alleging at the targeted institution. If we can get 1,000 of Mark J. Perrys to do this in the next 3 years, we could effectively end misandrist Title IX discrimination in US universities. Those are the doctors we need. And I speak from experience here. This year, our operation contributed to flattening several unconstitutional laws in Romania. We would have never made it if not for the handful of activists willing to write the petitions and submit them to the Ombudsman, to the Parliament and other institutions, and never stop the pressure. Yes, we, the researchers, did the important work of putting the jurisprudence together, or I believe you would call them case law in the Anglosphere. But anyway, we did that, but without the foot soldiers to implement, we wouldn't have made even 10% of the progress we actually made, because it is nearly impossible to be a researcher and a doctor at the same time. You can do it for a few months at the beginning, but then it becomes too complicated. Any successful operation needs both generals and foot soldiers. Soldiers without wise generals are destined to perish or disassemble as a unit. Generals without soldiers are basically a disconnected, disillusioned, bitter ivory tower armchair elitists who nobody cares about, which is precisely what we're doing to feminists. We're only leaving the elite, disconnecting them from their base. The inflection point gives the opportunity to recruit a lot more foot soldiers to implement the already impressive pile of work that the non-feminist sector has already produced. How that growth will be managed will also make the difference. And finally, the third thing to do, more patience. Now, I don't think I need to explain to this audience what that means. Although it looks on the graph as if it's a whole lot easier because exponential growth might come, keep in mind that the third curve is a 10 years interval. The fourth will be at least 15 years. It's doable, and if we stick to the science, and yes, there is a science on how these things are being done, we will succeed. But patience is paramount. And anyway, in my case, patience and tobacco. Alrighty, so chapter 4, I guess, some conclusions. The narrative curve is ruthless. If you make too many mistakes, you have to start almost from the start. It's not like in video games where you can save your progress. Those who understand this mechanism intimately defend their progress quite vigorously, precisely because they know how much is at stake. Let me give you an example. In April 2018, the Trump administration changed the definition of domestic violence and sexual assault from a feminist-inspired definition to one that is more in line with a non-feminist definition. The Justice Department's definition only considers physical harm that constitutes a felony or misdemeanor to be domestic violence, meaning other forms of domestic violence such as psychological abuse, coercive control and manipulation no longer fall under the department's definition. How did the feminists react to this? Trump administration rolling back women's rights by 50 years by changing definitions of domestic violence and sexual assault, the Russian-owned British paper The Independent titled. Did women's rights just got rolled back 50 years in the last 2 years? No, of course not. But the progress of feminists on the narrative curve was rolled back. Not by 50 years, but by 15 at the very least. Why? Because with that change comes a lot of changes in the institutional feminist framework. No more pork bloated dollars for every vindictive lady who starts the process that we've come to call divorce rape by making a false allegation at a shelter. No more public shekels for frivolous cases previously pursued vigorously by eager attorneys paid for by feminist institutions with your tax dollars. And on like that it goes. These are the changes triggered by that particular definition change. It lowered their progress on the narrative curve. Now they basically have to start the narrative curve once again. All it took was one mistake, really. The mistake being to over-evaluate their position on the narrative curve, which ended up with Trump being elected. Also, bad luck. Bad luck being Trump actually following through with the promise to undermine feminist efforts to scheme the public coffers in the name of women. That was bad luck for them, really. Without that mistake, this talk now would have been on a less optimistic tone. Maybe now we would have started climbing on the third curve. Hysteria and lack of grounding was their mistake. Now it's our turn to take advantage of that. But make no mistake, we have to stay away from serious mistakes ourselves, because the opposition is still more numerous and better financed, albeit their overall strength is lower than it was 10 years ago. Remember when Breitbart said that politics is downstream from culture? Well, the time for politics is now finally coming, and we all better be prepared for it. And with that, I thank you all for watching. Thank you for attending my talk. Thank you for supporting the 2020 edition of the International Conference on Men's Issues. Now, I cannot guarantee that I will be able to reply to the comments when this gets published, so feel free to drop me a line at lucian@freedomalternative.com. It's more likely that I will reply to that one, hopefully. Anyway, thanks for watching, and enjoy the next speaker.